Cliff and Cydney got married, celebrating their wedding surrounded by family, close friends and colleagues. It was truly a spectacular event. Guests congratulated the newlyweds, wishing for them to remember this wedding forever. Soon the Andersons set off on their honeymoon to Hawaii. This trip promised to be fun and full of memorable adventures. After a helicopter ride over the island, the couple rented a car and continued their journey. Stopping at a store, they bought a map and all the necessary road supplies. A tourist shop clerk explained to them how to get to the valley and back. Cliff and Cydney were confident that this would be their perfect honeymoon. By the way, a young couple recently perished in this area. So far everything was going great. The newlyweds were driving forward, surrounded by picturesque landscapes. Happy Cydney was singing along to the radio. Seeing a couple on the road, Cliff stopped. Cydney thought picking up strangers was a bad idea. However, Cliff didn't take his wife's concerns seriously until a burly guy named Cale got into their car. Cliff said that alas they were not on their way. Cale and Cleo had also recently gotten married. Cleo wanted to show Cydney their wedding photos. Cale asked his wife to hurry up, feeling that they were imposing on the young couple. In the end Cliff agreed to give them a ride, but now Cale didn't want to go with them, rather rudely telling Cleo to get out of the car. The slamming door made Cydney wince. So the Andersons continued their journey alone. Within an hour, they had forgotten about the strange couple and were enjoying the beach. Cydney wanted to take as many photos as possible. They visited all the most scenic spots in the jungle near the beach. Walking along the steep rocky shore is far from safe. Inexperienced tourists can easily fall, which almost happened to Cydney. It was at this moment that they met Nick, who helped them. Cliff shared that he is a screenwriter. He is currently working on his first serious project. Nick in turn said that he dreams of writing a book. But until inspiration strikes, he travels the world seeking adventures. From the conversation, Nick realized that Cliff was not very successful in his profession. His screenplay was sent for revision, and his agent wasn't looking for new projects for him. Cliff made it clear that he didn't want to talk about himself anymore. Further along the coast, the company came across 3 female tourists who couldn't catch cell service. There was really no signal. The women were frightened because of a recent incident where a married couple was found lifeless. It is only known that a man and a woman are suspected. Despite everything, Cydney was not intending to go home because she had been looking forward to this trip for a long time. Learning that Nick was planning to go to a very beautiful place, Cydney also wanted to go there. Cliff tried to dissuade his wife from this idea, but she wanted some romance. Seeing those 3 women leaving the coast, Cliff decided to please Cydney after all, especially since it was only a 1-mile walk through the jungle. While Cydney was swimming in a warm lake with Nick and his girlfriend Gina, Cliff was trying to get a cell signal. When Cliff managed to get online, he saw news that the criminals had reportedly headed to this island. The cameras had managed to capture photos of the suspects. The photo didn't load in time. Seeing Cleo and Cale in front of him, Cliff got nervous, thinking that they were the criminals since the descriptions matched. Cale didn't like that Cliff had previously lied about not heading in the same direction. Cliff, being mild-mannered by nature, tried to resolve the conflict peacefully. The conversation was interrupted by Nick, whom Cliff saw as protection. Next to Nick, he felt confident because Cale radiated danger. The guys left, and in the meantime Cydney and Gina were chatting amiably. Soon the company was preparing to continue their journey. Gina joined them. Cliff realized that their beach passes had gone missing. There were some abandoned items around, among which Cliff found a calling card of a parole officer. On the way, Nick mentioned that he was a former soldier who served in Iraq. Hearing some details of Nick's past, the Andersons were shocked. This guy seemed to have seen a lot of things in his life. The scary thing was that Nick carries a knife with him everywhere. He claimed it was an old habit. When Cliff managed to load the suspect's photo, he immediately showed it to his wife. Cliff thought there was a resemblance. But the wife thought he was imagining things. It could be anyone. Cliff insisted that they didn't know their fellow travelers at all. Cydney didn't want to hear it anymore. While the couple argued, Nick and Gina watched them from the side, wondering what they were talking about. It started raining, so the company had to set up camp. At first everything was going fine, but suddenly Nick noticed they weren't alone. Maybe it was just his imagination, or it could have been an animal. Cliff started getting nervous, which became a reason for jokes. Nick thought Cliff was completely unprepared for life and too cowardly. When Nick suggested to his new acquaintance that they go hunting together in the jungle, Cliff preferred to stay at the camp with the women, but eventually, not wanting to seem like a weakling, he changed his mind. In reality, the hunt was just a pretext. Nick had invited Cliff into the forest because he had previously noticed 2 people here. They might be the criminals. Cliff's panic was growing. He was worried about Cydney, who had stayed at the camp. Nick, looking quite relaxed, assured him that Gina could take care of both herself and Cydney. Meanwhile, the women were talking. Gina asked the new acquaintance to tell her about herself. Cydney shared that she and Cliff dream of having children, but it hasn't worked out yet. Cliff followed Nick through the jungle when he suddenly noticed someone nearby. Cydney had a difficult past. Her parents divorced long ago, and each took 2 children. Cydney, being the 5th child, ended up in a foster family. But that's far from the worst she has had to endure. Their candid conversation was interrupted by a falling branch, making the women flinch. Cale and Cleo also got caught in the rain in the jungle and lit a fire. While Nick was spying on them, someone sneaked up behind him. It turned out to be just the guy from the tourist shop. He was here because Cliff and Cydney had forgotten their passes. Cliff was surprised that the guy had traveled such a long way for them. Finally, the rain stopped. Cliff returned from the jungle without Nick. However, Nick showed up a few minutes later, carrying game on his shoulders. Nick was very pleased with himself. This strange couple was scaring Cliff and Cydney more and more. They felt that these two had escaped from a mental institution. The Andersons decided to return to the beach in the morning, which was 2 miles away. This was not how they had imagined their honeymoon. In the morning, the company was awakened by the sound of a helicopter engine. It was the Hawaii Island police there to arrest Cleo and Cale. Nick and Gina were sure that this couple was the criminals everyone was looking for. During the arrest, Cleo resisted. Cale noticed an officer rummaging through his backpack and finding many knocked out teeth. It seems now the tourists can feel relieved and continue their vacation peacefully. They all arrived at the edge of beautiful sunsets. The 2 couples became good friends and took photos of each other. Later, they had fun on the beach. Afterward, Cliff suggested to Nick that they explore a nearby sea cave. Nick was lazy, but eventually he agreed. While the women stayed on the beach, the men sailed 2 boats against the current. Gina wanted to photograph them with the Andersons' camera, and at that moment she saw that the bride and groom in the wedding photos were entirely different people. Gina shouted to Nick to come back, but he couldn't hear her. Nick was confident that nothing bad would happen if he left for an hour. Gina thought frantically about what to do next. Of course, there was no cell signal. Dropping the camera, Gina started to run. Realizing that their secret with Pseudo Cliff had been exposed, Pseudo Cydney chased after her. While the guys were far from shore, the chase continued. Nick and the person he believed to be Cliff ended up in the sea cave. Gina climbed up a rock in an attempt to escape the crazy woman. Nick doesn't suspect anything yet and feels completely relaxed, talking with his new buddy about various things. As the horrifying truth dawned on Nick, he reached for his knife. At that moment, Cliff pulled out a gun, saying that no one can be fully prepared for any situation. Cliff, whose real name is Rocky, was the criminal, and Cydney was his accomplice. They had assumed the identities of the last couple they had hunted. The criminals had taken the belongings and documents of their previous victims, as well as their teeth, to throw it in the river. This way the police wouldn't be able to identify the bodies. Later, the criminal couple rehearsed the story they would stick to during their journey when meeting new people. The imposters had fully immersed themselves in the roles of Cliff and Cydney Anderson. Meanwhile, Gina and Nick set off on a trip to Hawaii. Gina hoped that Nick would finally ask her to marry him. He indeed planned to propose during the sunset on the Hawaiian Islands. Around the same time, 2 unidentified bodies were found on the island. The imposters kept an eye on the news to ensure the police hadn't caught their trail. In search of new victims, they observed various people. Seeing Cale and Cleo on the jungle road, they thought they were perfect candidates to frame, diverting suspicion from themselves. Taking Nick and Gina as traveling companions, the imposters planned to lead them to a remote beach where there would be no witnesses. Rocky played the role of a harmless, modest guy very well. Feeling the pseudo Cydney's sympathy for Gina, Rocky reminded her that they must not get attached to anyone. All Rocky wanted was to feel like a god again, powerful over other people's lives. This caused a small disagreement. Among other things, Cydney also wanted to enjoy the vacation. Luring Nick and Gina into a trap, Rocky intended to carry out his gruesome plan. Seeing that Cydney was hesitating, he reassured her, saying they were made for this. Cydney doesn't know if she can believe Rocky's words about love. Maybe she just wants to believe in the sincerity of his feelings. Now Rocky fired a shot, wounding Nick. Gina, watching from above the rocky shore, managed to dodge the next shot. A fight broke out between her and Cydney. At one point, after hitting the opponent hard, Cydney ran at her, but Gina managed to push her into the water from a great height. Unable to walk properly due to her injuries, Gina called out to Nick in desperation. Down below near the overturned boat in the water, he was gone. Limping, Gina returned to the shore. When the phone rang, she flinched. It was a mobile service operator asking if she was satisfied with the service quality. In a panic before the signal was lost, Gina explained that she was on a Hawaiian island and that dangerous criminals were operating here. Seeing Cydney paddling away from the shore in a boat, Gina was momentarily confused. The mobile signal was lost. Suddenly Rocky grabbed Gina, having climbed up the cliff to the shore. Gina managed to break free and dodge the shots. Seizing the moment, she seriously injured Rocky. Cydney watched this from a distance. Rocky was furious, Having lost sight of Gina, he told Cydney over the radio that they couldn't let Gina return to the beach for help. Cydney promised to take care of it. Meanwhile, Nick, who had survived despite his serious injury, regained consciousness in the water inside the cave. Now he was determined to save the beloved at any cost. While Rocky was chasing Gina through the jungle, she continued to flee and ran into a group of tourists. In a panic, she tried to explain to them that there was a dangerous armed man nearby. A few minutes later, Rocky appeared, once again playing the role of a harmless guy. Cydney, seeing the police helicopter, began signaling. Pseudo-Cliff told the tourists that Gina was his friend and that she was hallucinating due to substance abuse. The guys, from whom someone had stolen boats earlier, didn't believe him because, unlike Gina, his pupils were dilated. Rocky started shooting, taking the lives of all 4 tourists. Since he ran out of bullets, Gina managed to escape. Rocky reloaded his gun. At that moment, Nick jumped on him from above. Hearing the screams, Gina stopped. Both Nick and Rocky were seriously injured. Seeing that her beloved was alive, Gina felt hopeful. Nick was about to finish it and pull the trigger. The police helicopter was already nearby. Seeing Nick with a gun, the officers thought he was the criminal. Cydney was the only one who could disprove this. The police were preparing to shoot, but at the last moment Gina shielded Nick and pulled him aside. After that, she hit Rocky. Cydney found the courage to confess that Rocky was behind all the crimes. When Rocky tried to raise his gun, a police officer fired. Gina and Nick were evacuated by helicopter. He finally proposed to her. Now they would definitely be happy. However, the couple decided that they would do without the honeymoon. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.